Okay, so welcome everybody to our free speech town hall and the launch of our new book, Free Speech in Canada, A Beginner's Guide from Ancient Roots to Modern Controversies. I got mine here too. All right, so I'm Josh DeHaas, counsel with the CCF, and I'm here with my co-author, Christine Van Gyn, who is our litigation director, as well as Russell Phillips, who is our comms director. And you might have noticed our boss, Joanna Barron, is missing today, but she has a very good excuse. She is actually in Ottawa as we speak, testifying before a parliamentary committee about why Bill C-63, the Online Harms Act, is still a very large risk to freedom of expression in Canada, even though the government just announced that they're going to split the bill in two, with some of the more concerning provisions possibly dead. So for those of you who've bought the book, thank you very much. We really appreciate it. And for those of you who haven't, you can find it on Amazon for $9.99 for the print edition and $5.99 for the Kindle edition. This book is really meant for busy people who are concerned about freedom of expression in Canada, but who don't necessarily want to, pick up a textbook. So sorry if you're an academic, this book might not be for you, but if you're pretty much anybody else, somebody who's concerned about the Freedom Convoy or the Jordan Peterson affair or the Online Harms Act, then we think you'll get a lot out of this book. And it's a pretty short read. It takes about an hour to get through. So today, Christine and I are going to go through the chapters that we wrote, and we're going to try and take less than half an hour to do that. It'll be a little crash course on free speech history. And then we're going to spend about half an hour taking your questions. So Russ is going to be the jockey for that, and you can ask your questions using the Q&A function, and then Russ is going to sort through those, and we'll do our best to answer as many as possible. So this book opens in ancient Greece, where freedom of expression was invented. The Athenians had a couple different concepts that we now understand to be free speech. One is called isegoria, which meant roughly the right to speak publicly on civic matters. And the other one is called parrhesia, which is the right to speak frankly and without fear. And the point is that free speech and democracy were born together. They go hand in hand. And this makes a lot of sense because you can't have a democracy if the citizens can't speak their minds. I included a quotation that I really liked that I think sums it all up from the great orator Demosthenes. He said that what set the Athenians apart from the Spartans was that the Athenians could criticize their own constitution and praise Sparta's, while the Spartans could only criticize the Athenians. So what happens next? We all know Athens fell, and it's more than a millennia before true democracies and free speech start to reemerge. And that fragility of free speech throughout history is one of the themes of this book. So, we skip ahead through the Dark Ages, which were dark in part because there was no free speech. And it's really not until after the invention of the printing press around 1450 that free speech emerges again in the public consciousness in Europe. This makes sense because printed books, mass-produced, are a lot harder for the church and the state to control, but we can't say they didn't try. They certainly did. For example, in England, they used the Court of the Star Chamber to punish those people who printed without a license. And one of the moments where the concept of freedom of speech really captures the public's imagination and gets entrenched into the UK's unwritten constitution is when John Lilburne gets prosecuted for smuggling illegal pamphlets into the UK from the Netherlands. For this crime of smuggling pamphlets, he gets sentenced by the Star Chamber to being tied to a cart and dragged for 2 miles while being whipped along the way after he's put in the pillory, and he just keeps handing out the pamphlets. He doesn't repent. And there are sort of proto-journalists there, and they're covering this, and the public sides with Lilburne. And this leads to the eventual demise of the Star Chamber and the eventual rise of the right of free speech. And Lilburne's one of my favorite characters. The ideas he had were radical at the time. He was a member of a group called the Levelers, and they wanted a more level society. He believed in things like, more people should have the right to vote. There should be a separation of church and state. Very radical things back then, but he used his free speech to push those ideas and eventually helped along the very concept of free speech itself. And so a similar story plays out in the US and in Canada, and I won't get into too many details on that. You'll have to read the book for that. And then we move on to chapter 2. So this is all about hate speech laws in Canada, everyone's favorite topic. So the chapter focuses on the Keekstra case. James Keekstra, for those who don't know, was a high school teacher and sort of your classic anti-Semite. And no one would disagree with firing Keekstra, but the question for the court was whether, for the things he had said about Jewish people in the classroom, should he go to jail? Because at the end of the day, his crime was words. And the Keekstra case is kind of an iconic battle for free expression. And in a 4-3 nail-biter decision, free speech, in my opinion, lost. So just as a bit of an aside, I'm going to go on a tangent here, and this is one thing I don't really get into in the book and that we might add in the next edition, Christine, so watch out, is that this concept of hate speech was originally pushed by illiberal authoritarian countries. So liberty-minded people seem to have always known that hate speech as a concept is a risk to free speech. And so when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was being debated, it was actually Stalin's Russia, theocratic Saudi Arabia, and authoritarian South Africa that were pushing for hate speech to be included in the charter. And that's because, authoritarians like the idea of being able to say, oh, your speech is hateful and therefore I can shut it down. But Eleanor Roosevelt was the US's delegate to the UN committee, and she vehemently opposed this. She knew that hate speech as a concept would be used to silence people. And she said, quote, "It is equally difficult to differentiate between the various shades of feeling, ranging from hatred to ill feeling to mere dislike." And she warned any criticism of public or religious authorities might all too easily be described as incitement to hatred and consequently prohibited. So Roosevelt initially won. She got Canada and the UK and some of Europe on board, but eventually in the ICCPR, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, that passed in 1966, free speech lost, and that international agreement supposedly requires all countries to have hate speech laws. And so we get to 1970, where Pierre Trudeau's government passed criminal laws that are still in the books against hate speech. And these got tested in the Keekstra case that I'm talking about. So in Keekstra, Chief Justice Dixon, with the votes of 3 other judges, upheld the hate speech laws, basically because he found that hate speech can cause pain, it can cause tension between people, it can lead to violence. And in his view, it had led to the Holocaust. And that makes hate speech a demonstrably justified limit on expression. So a fairly convincing argument, but Justice McLaughlin, who was in the minority and went on to become the next Chief Justice, defended free speech, and she would have not upheld these hate speech laws. So McLaughlin was concerned that the law didn't require any proof of actual harm, literally just words could land you in jail, and that worried her. And she also pointed out that hate speech laws don't necessarily reduce hate. They tend to create martyrs. Pre-Nazi Germany, she points out, had hate speech laws. She also channels her inner Eleanor Roosevelt, and she points out that hatred is a very subjective, hard to define concept with many meanings, or many shades, as Roosevelt had put it. And she pointed out that the law is therefore going to chill a lot of perfectly legitimate speech. For example, Salman Rushdie's Satanic Verses was a really big hit book at the time, but it had been held up at the border because border officials thought it was anti-Islamic hate speech. And she worried about scientists being censored, and she worried about not being able to discuss immigration because people would be accused of hate speech. And she says in her decision, quote, "Attempts to confine the guarantee of free expression only to the content which is judged to possess redeeming value or to accord with the accepted values strike at the very essence of the value of the freedom, reducing the realm of productive discussion to that which is comfortable and compatible with current conceptions. If the guarantee of free expression is to be meaningful, it must protect expression which challenges even the very basic conceptions about our society." So the point she was making is that what we believe today might turn out to be wrong tomorrow. We need to be able to debate it, to figure that out. John Lilburn is a great example of this. The things he was challenging, that more people should be allowed to vote, or that there should be separation of church and state. Those got at the very conceptions of society, and yet he was right, and we would all agree now that he was right. So he should have been able to say that. We give lots of examples of this in the book, and we point out how Keekstra inevitably led to more calls to criminalize even free speech, which we at the CCF deal with every day. including a new provision in 2022 that criminalized condoning, denying, or downplaying the Holocaust. Now, obviously, I don't support condoning, denying, or downplaying the Holocaust, but it leads to this slippery slope, and that predictably led to calls to criminalize so-called residential school denialism. And again, residential schools, many terrible things happen. But we now have the leading proponent of a law to criminalize denialism saying things like, and she said this at an event that Christine and I attended, and our jaws kind of dropped when we heard her say this. She thinks it should be illegal to say things like, quote, "I don't believe there's burials," or "I think the Indians are lying to get money," or that they're burning down churches or trying to take your cottages away. And these are all things that people should be allowed to debate, even if it's insensitive or hurts people's feelings. Anyway, so that's chapter 2. Chapter 3, we talk about human rights tribunals. And we have a great example of human rights tribunals going too far with freedom of speech. Just a couple weeks ago, I actually just spoke with the mayor involved in this. So stay tuned for that. Basically, this town in Northern Ontario was told that it was discriminatory for this mayor to oppose flying the pride flag. And he's been fined for that for $5,000. And the town has been fined because they voted against a proclamation for Pride Month, a huge free speech issue. So that didn't make it into the book, but we do talk about the other big case decided at the same time as Keekstra, which is the Taylor case. Taylor was another of these neo-Nazis, and the case was about whether the Canadian Human Rights Act, Section 13(1), which barred discriminatory speech or speech likely to expose a person to hatred or contempt, was constitutional. Again, the Dixon found that this was fine, that it was a reasonable limit on free speech, while McLaughlin and her judges were in the minority there. So Dixon justified this by basically brushing aside that argument from Roosevelt and McLaughlin that words like hatred and contempt can't be easily defined, so the law is going to chill all kinds of non-hateful speech. He said, no, it's easy to define. It just applies to, quote, unusually strong and deep felt emotions of detestation and vilification. He said there's little danger that subjective opinion as to offensiveness will supplant the proper meaning of the section. Of course, we're, 34 years later, we still have no idea what speech is going to be found by courts to be offensive and therefore legal, and what is going to count as detestation or vilification. And this obviously leads to a lot of chill. People that engage in the Israel-Palestine debate or debates around race or gender identity are accused of hate speech all the time. And presumably lots of people just bow out of that conversation because they don't want to face that accusation. So in 2014, there's a big famous case called Watcott. I won't get into it too deeply. We intervened, the CCF, and the SCC, the Supreme Court, tried to clarify that Taylor ruling in Watcott, and they did a pretty poor job, if you ask me. But thankfully, after a big outcry following the certain journalists being brought before the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal for their journalistic work, the Harper government in 2013 got rid of Section 13 of the Canadian Human Rights Act. But as you may know, the current government, as part of this Online Harms Act, is proposing to bring back Section 13. So we could once again see a tribunal able to fine you and force you to pay damages to people who you've supposedly said hateful things to, this time online. So we're really hoping that doesn't happen. Okay, so I'm going to skip ahead to the last chapter that I wrote with the assistance of one of our wonderful summer students, Miles. And this is about freedom of the press. So I'll talk about this pretty quickly. Press freedom has been under attack, just like freedom of speech, as long as there have been presses. And it's fragile, but it did become cemented in the Constitution through certain, big public controversies where the public sided with the speaker or the person printing the book or the newspaper. And one example we give that I like is from 1735. And this is where a New York jury refused to convict a New York Weekly Journal publisher, Peter Zenger, for printing satirical ballads that made fun of the governor. The public did not like the governor, and they sided with the printer and refused to play along with censoring this speech. We also talk about Germany, where the Weimar Constitution, so the constitution in place between the world wars, gave everyone freedom of the press, but came with a special exception called Article 48 that allowed newspapers to be banned in emergencies. And we explain how in 1931, the Social Democratic government decided to censor the pro-Nazi newspapers using this emergency power. But rather than preventing their ideas, they seem to have only made Hitler and his ideas more popular because they made him into a martyr. And this just goes to show how censorship can backfire even from well-meaning censors, if there is such a thing, and how we need to be wary of use of emergency laws. We also talk about the Alberta Press case, which is when the Supreme Court said that Alberta's social credit government could not pass an act that compelled newspapers, when called upon to do so by the government, to publish government rebuttals. This was obviously compelled speech and major interference with the press. And, governments still demand that you print their rebuttals to this day. I know that from working in journalism, but thanks to our Constitution, they can't require us to publish them. And of course, we talk about other big free speech cases, and we end up where in modern times where freedom of press remains under threat, primarily from things like the Online News Act, which is the act that caused your news to disappear from Facebook and Instagram, and the Online Streaming Act, which gave the CRTC the power to regulate all of the internet and to prioritize content from certain groups like racialized people, Indigenous people, or Francophones, which is obviously a big limit on the expression of everyone who doesn't fall into those categories. Okay, so those are the chapters I wrote. We'll take questions at the end, but I'm going to pass it over to Christine to talk about the parts of the book that she wrote.
Yeah, thanks so much, Josh. And working on this book with you was so much fun. It's Josh's first book, so congrats to Josh on the publication. So I wrote a couple of chapters, the later chapters of the book, and one of them is called The Curse of the Local Tyrant. And if you follow our YouTube channel, you'll know that I have a video about this as well. So the idea of the curse of the local tyrant is we often think that it's the federal government that creates the greatest risk to our fundamental freedoms, including our freedom of speech. But it's in fact often our local municipal governments that are the closest to us, and they can have the biggest impact on our lives. So what we have seen is a number of cities imposing quite censorious laws on the people of those cities and towns and villages. And often the smaller the town, it can be quite bad. You would think that the smaller the town, the less maybe busybodies they would be, but it doesn't seem to be the case. So I'll go through a couple of the examples that we outline in the book. One is the city of Waterloo, the region of Waterloo. They enacted a bylaw that prohibits communications that reasonably constitute harassment, and they define harassment as experiencing objectionable or unwelcome conduct, comment, bullying, or actions that could reasonably cause offense. So this idea that you cannot be offended on Waterloo property. It only applies to regionally owned property. Now, anyone who violates this bylaw that bans you from bullying or offending other people can face a fine of up to $5,000. And we announced after this was enacted that we would be filing a constitutional challenge. We did file that, and I'll have some updates at the end of this explanation about where all of these cases stand. Another case we describe in the book is Niagara Regional Council. They proposed a bylaw that would ban members of the public from having flag signs and props in city council chambers. They said it was distracting. Now, I will note that at this council meeting where they wanted to ban all these so-called distractions. Many of the counselors were, texting away on their phones the whole time. So clearly they are willing to be distracted by some things, but not others. They're willing to be distracted by their own Instagram and Twitter accounts, but not by their constituents trying to send them a message, I suppose. So think about how this would work. Banning flag signs and props would mean you couldn't wear a poppy for Remembrance Day. You couldn't have a Canadian flag, a pride flag, a button that says lower my taxes. Any of these things would be banned, and you could be kicked out of council chambers for wearing them. So we wrote threatening a lawsuit citing existing case law about signs in public galleries. And as a result, we didn't have to litigate. They amended their bylaws, so there's no longer this blanket prohibition on signs, flags, and props. So our advocacy really does work. Another example is in the city of Whitehorse in the Yukon. They introduced what is called a civility policy that did what Niagara was trying to do, ban signs at council meetings, but it also banned what they refer to as microaggressions. So they define that as, I think it was subconscious thoughts that cause offense to others. So apparently thinking the wrong thing is now prohibited in the Whitehorse as well. We wrote to them asking them to change this. They did not respond. And so after they refused to fix this policy, we filed a lawsuit against Whitehorse as well. We also represented a woman in Port Coburn. I've talked about this case quite a bit on our YouTube channel. So this woman in Port Coburn, she, was unhappy with the election results a couple of years ago that led to Trudeau's election. So she hung a flag on her house that said, forget Trudeau. It didn't say forget, it said a different F word with a maple leaf in place of the U. So she hung this flag on her house. And, some people were horrified by this language, and a bylaw officer was sent to her house and they told her to take the flag down. We hired a lawyer for her because we think you are entitled in this country to criticize your leadership using whatever words you want, including offensive words. Even if I would not choose to use that type of language, or you might not choose that language, she has a right to use whatever language she wants if she's angry about who was elected, and to express herself about a political idea. And this is a really special thing. I mean, think of all of the places around the world where you cannot criticize your leader. If you tried to, you could end up in a prison. Like, think about what's happened in Syria. If you tried to criticize the government there, you wouldn't just be arrested, your whole family could be thrown into a dungeon. So this is a really precious right that Melissa had to use this language that not all of us might use, but she can use it to criticize her leader. So after we hired the lawyer for Melissa, the city of Port Coburn rescinded this order against her that had required her to take down her flag, and she could keep that flag flying. Another case about these local tyrants that we're working on is in the city of Calgary. Now, they banned protests near libraries on the basis of the subject matter of the protests beginning in 2023. And they used a bylaw they enacted called the Safe and Inclusive Bylaw. So this sort of Orwellian language to prohibit expression of ideas that the government has decided that these ideas are not allowed. And restricting a protest on the basis of its subject matter is clearly unconstitutional. The right to freedom of expression is a content neutral right, and it is not up to the government to decide what topics we can protest and what topics we cannot. So when this bylaw was introduced, we filed a constitutional challenge, and we are looking forward to hearing on that in early 2025. That's going to be in February. Now, the last thing I'll say about municipal freedom of expression relates to this emerging trend of these codes of conduct that are created by municipal councils and are increasingly being weaponized against fellow politicians, municipal politicians. So there's a case that we're involved in Prince Edward Island where a local councillor in a village called Murray Harbor was sanctioned by his fellow councillors for a sign that he put up questioning the discovery of what he called a mass grave outside the former Kamloops Indian residential school. This was a sign on his private property. And, we argue that he cannot be disciplined for this type of speech. That's his expressive right. And that, in his case, the higher level of government, the provincial government, actually wanted to have him removed from council where he'd been, democratically elected. So we do have some updates on these cases. The PEI and Calgary cases are both going to be argued in February, and the Waterloo case is most likely going to be argued in the later half of next year. And we think we will have some news on Whitehorse soon. We don't have anything yet, but we did file the materials and we're hoping to have something to announce really soon on that. So we are actively litigating on all of these topics that we're describing in the book. And if you make sure that you're signed up to the email list at the ccf.ca/freedom updates, we provide regular updates as these cases progress. Now, the next chapter of the book I want to talk about is what I call the new censorship. It's a chapter called How Professional Regulators Are Silencing Speech. Now, this is not direct censorship by the government, but rather the regulatory bodies that many Canadians are members of regulated professions, whether they're teachers, nurses, psychologists, lawyers, accountants. They are members of professional professions that are regulated by these self-regulating bodies. And these self-regulating bodies are claiming control over more and more of the lives and speech of their members. And I think everyone's probably familiar with the very, very famous case involving Jordan Peterson being punished for some posts he made on social media and sent to re-education by the College of Psychologists. But there's many cases like his. There are people in all kinds of professions. So many of us are in regulated professions. Both Josh and I are members of regulated professions as lawyers, and I'm sure many of you listening are as well. And these professional regulatory bodies serve an important purpose. They exist to stop things like, doctors from sexually harassing their patients or accountants from harassing their clients, to prevent lawyers from stealing from trust accounts, to prevent someone from giving incompetent advice or leveraging their professional credentials to run a scam. That's all a really valid role for these regulators. But increasingly, members of these professions are not being punished for doing those bad things. They're being punished for their speech that's completely off duty. They're chilling at home on the couch and tweet out something about their views on society, on politics, on religion or culture, and they're dragged before a disciplinary body. So in this chapter of the book, we consider the case of a nurse who was punished for advocating for the need for improved health care after seeing her grandfather receive what she thought was inadequate end-of-life care, and she was disciplined by her regulator for that. We were actually involved in that case, and we had that discipline overturned. We consider the case of a nurse who was punished for attending an anti-abortion protest, of a doctor who had complaints made against her because she advocated for gun control. This is all censorship because the regulator can take away the livelihood of their members if they say something unpopular. And we know that it's leading to a chill on speech, and that members of these professions are already self-censoring. They're saying, I'm not going to even comment on political or social issues because, the Law Society or the College of Psychologists or the Teachers College, they might not like it. So I'm just going to stay out of that. And that's wrong because you don't need to check your constitutional rights at the door when you enter a regulated profession. So I propose a few ways we could fix this in the chapter. I say we could roll back some of the overreach by these regulators. by creating an explicit requirement for regulators to receive training in constitutional rights and ensuring that their decisions get less deference from the courts when constitutional rights are engaged. You know, the people who make up these regulatory bodies of psychologists or doctors or nurses, you know, they may be technical experts in their fields. They may be excellent engineers, excellent accountants, excellent doctors, but they're not experts in constitutional protections. And their decisions when these constitutional rights are engaged should not be treated with undue deference by the courts. I also want there to be an explicit requirement that there's a connection between the practice of the profession and the speech itself if the regulator is going to claim jurisdiction. They don't just get to control every aspect of somebody's life just because they joined a profession. So that's the chapter on professional bodies. There's also a chapter on freedom of expression and property rights. And they have a surprising connection. You know, property rights, a lot of people think, you know, we don't have property rights in Canada because they're not explicitly protected by the Charter, but that's not correct. Canadians have pre-charter common law property rights, and there are specific pieces of legislation that grant protections to property, like the Canadian Bill of Rights or provincial legislation on forfeiture and takings. And there's a really important intersection between expression and property. And a legal scholar, Leonid Sirota, has written about how secure property rights are a necessary foundation for many other rights, in particular for those in Section 2B of the Charter. And Sirota provides an example, like the printing press or websites. You can't really have freedom of expression if the government bans the internet, if the government bans newspapers, if the government bans the technology or the property related to being able to express yourself. So we use our, so that's one aspect. There's also an interesting series of cases involving homeowners and how they use their property. So we can use our property, our physical land, to express our beliefs and creativity. And there's these cases that I've been reading and working on a little bit about how some homeowners use landscape and garden design to express political and environmental beliefs. And we're actually working on a case about this, which we haven't announced yet, but we're hoping to quite soon. And we have a few other projects about this idea of using physical property to express artistic and political beliefs. Now, there's also another way that government can infringe on expression and it's by regulating what people can do with their property and that prevents them from politically organizing. There's a famous 1957 Supreme Court case called the Padlock Law case involving a Quebec law that permitted the government to order the closing of any property that was used to promote communism, which was a political issue at the time. I mean, some of us might say communism is still an issue. Anyway, this law that allowed the government to order the closing of property used for this type of political organizing, that law ultimately was struck down by the Supreme Court. And it's an important, although it was decided on, I think it was on federalism grounds, it's an important case related to how property and expression intersect. We, of course, have a lot to say about the intersection of property rights and protests as it related to the 2022 Freedom Convoy. That's a big case that we've been involved in. We were the organization that challenged the Trudeau government's invocation of that act. And the judge in the lower court case, in the federal court case, he struck down the regulations that froze bank accounts, which is personal property, of protesters who were allegedly violating certain regulations that the government had created. And he found that the freezing of bank accounts was a violation of Section 8 of the Charter, which is the right to be free from an unreasonable search and seizure. Now, the last thing that we talk about in this chapter on property rights is the issue that for a period was like really this huge issue of protesters taking over physical property at universities. These anti-Israel protesters who occupied a number of universities. And the thing that's really important to remember is that the charter applies to government, not to private actors. And most of the case law in Canada determines that universities are not the government, they are a separate institution. And if a protest has occupied private property, which our case law mostly says universities are private property, then those protesters can be removed for trespassing. Property owners are entitled to enforce their property rights by having protesters removed. And in a very real sense, the occupation of private property is not a form of expression that the Constitution protects. It's rather a tort, it's a civil harm. So that is the outcome that we saw in sort of the most famous of the anti-Israel encampment cases, that injunction application at the University of Toronto that ultimately had those anti-Israel encampments removed. So the very last chapter, I'll say very briefly, is about the things that you can do to better protect the right to freedom of expression. The number one being actually reading the book and understanding your rights so that you can better advocate for yourself and better protect them. And talk to people about what you learned in the book. You can sign up for our email newsletter at the ccf.ca/freedom updates. You can watch our YouTube channel. You can sign up for our online learning courses at the ccf.ca/learn. We have one specifically dedicated to freedom of expression. You can write to your local politicians about problematic laws like Bill C-63. We have a portal on our website right now where you can write to your member of parliament about the problems you have with that law. You can visit the ccf.ca/fixc63. And we have a number of others as well. We have a petition up about the PEI counselor and about the Calgary protest ban. So that's it. That's kind of what I wrote about in the book, and it was a really fun project to be involved in. It's already an Amazon bestseller, so I hope you order your copy, and if you do, please leave a review on Amazon. Let's turn to the questions if there are any.
Excuse me, I was a little croaky there. So yeah, I see a few questions, and we've got a couple that are definitely promising. If you guys want to send some more in while we get to the first one here, that'd be appreciated as well. One question right off the top, I think Josh would be good for this question. It's very pertinent to some current events that we're probably all aware of. So an anonymous attendee asked, I was in a debate regarding free speech. I indicated to someone that I felt from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. Okay, sorry, I'm just trying to read this. I told my friend that its chance implication is to wipe out Israelis, although some will say it depends on the context. So what is your take on whether this chance should be punished or should be considered free speech, or is it hate speech? So I'm sure we've all heard of that chance. What are our thoughts on this?
Yeah, so we'll go first, and if Christine has something to add, I'd love to hear that too. So we get asked a lot about from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, and my take on it is that it's pretty clear what a lot of these people are saying. They do want to see Israel wiped off the map. I think it's anti-Semitic. I think it's hateful. Whether or not it's hate speech that could be lead to criminal charges, it's hard to know for sure, and that's sort of the big point here that McLaughlin was trying to make. Is that it's really hard to define what is hateful and what's actually just offensive speech, because offensive speech is protected, and it needs to be because, we need to, sometimes the things that are offensive to the powers that be need to be said in order for them to change, right? So that's the main problem here with hate speech in general. Funny enough, I was at a party about a week ago, and I was talking to a Crown about one of these cases, and he said, well, it wasn't this actual chant. It was something similar. It was something arguably anti-Semitic, but also arguably just pro-Palestinian. And he said, well, this charge, it all depends on the context. This was done in a Jewish neighborhood, and this was some vandalism, by the way. And it was targeting a Jewish person. And it just shows the problems with these potential prosecutions. the court has said, what counts as hate speech is the most extreme forms of detestation and vilification. And the court in the Ward case, which was a case about the comedian who made the joke about the child, they said not only is it about detestation and vilification, but it's also rises to the level where it's going to incite other people to either violence or to discrimination. And so that helps us a little bit. There has to be that incitement. But we still don't know. And in the Watcott decision, which I didn't get into, but I mentioned briefly, the judge says, yes, it has to be only those most extreme forms of detestation and vilification, but how do we know what that is? And then he says, well, you look for what are called the hallmarks of hatred. And then if you look at the hallmarks of hatred, they're, stuff that many people would consider just, mildly offensive or stuff that you would think was protected. So, one of them is plotting to destroy Western civilization. Apparently that's hate speech. But I think that there are lots of reasonable situations where you might say, I think these people are plotting to destroy Western civilization. Another one is targeting or delegitimizing a targeted group. Okay, what is delegitimizing? If we call people flooding over the border at Roxham Road in Quebec illegal immigrants, is that delegitimizing that group? This comes into play a lot in the gender debates, right? And also, one of the hallmarks of hatred is equating the group with groups that are traditionally reviled in society, such as child abusers or pedophiles. And to me, that brings to mind this group called Gays Against Groomers. And, they have this view about how gay children are somehow being pushed into gender transition. And that's the type of thing that you should be able to debate, even if it offends people. So, long story short, we don't know exactly where the line is. And with something like From the River to the Sea, Palestine will be free. You could see charges laid, or you could see charges not laid, or you could see a judge deciding it's hateful. You could see a judge deciding it's not hateful. So I wish I could answer that, but it just sort of shows the whole problem here.
Okay, another good question. I saw this one. I've reworded a bit and I'll field to Christine here. Um, so how much power should a professional regulator have over the speech of a professional? And the example this anonymous attendee said was an example of talking about vaccines if you were a chiropractic professional.
So I think what I've proposed is that in order to claim jurisdiction over speech, there must be a connection or a nexus between the speech and the profession. Like so someone speaking about vaccines, like a doctor talking to a patient about vaccines, that there is a nexus there, like a very obvious nexus. And giving incompetent advice would could result in discipline. And there's a case involving a physician in Ontario who was saying, I'm paraphrasing, but I'm a doctor and I think that the vaccines have 5G microchips in them, and Bill Gates is trying to kill you with them. And he was found to be incompetent. So there's a clear nexus, but I think that the problem, as it relates to vaccines, is that there was not space for reasonable scientific debate about vaccines during the pandemic, and that anything that questioned like a mainstream narrative about them could result in complaints, and that leads to a silencing effect. So I think with regard to vaccines, like what you need to show is that there's a nexus to the profession, and that there's something that clearly would rise to the level of like professional incompetence as it relates to the advice that they're giving. Just debating the efficacy and talking about different studies like that shouldn't rise to the level of discipline.
Okay, and another question here is from Alice Ross. Shouldn't legislation that regulations flow from already have the constitutional requirements in place? Leaving it to regulators to interpret seems lazy on the legislator's part. So,
Can I jump in there?
Sure.
Okay, so I like this question a lot because if you're thinking about legislation like the Human Rights Code, it doesn't say anything specific about protecting freedom of expression, and obviously that code is just a statute, so it has to comply with the Constitution and it has to be interpreted in a way that protects things like freedom of expression. Just to give you one example. But regulators, they do that. So if you're like a human rights tribunal, your focus is on equality, and so you're not thinking much about free speech. And in that case from Emo Township, where the town council was found to have discriminated in their discussions of the pride flag and the vote on whether to make the proclamation, the adjudicator or the decision maker doesn't really consider freedom of expression at all. She even says, well, I'm not going to order them to raise the flag because that might be a freedom of expression issue. But then she says they discriminated in their discussion and their decision not to make the proclamation. So they should be considering it. They're required to under the Constitution, but they often don't. And legislators could do a lot to fix human rights tribunals by putting some requirements that they respect speech in the code. Like a simple one would just be saying proclamations and flag raisings are political speech and they're not services under the code and you don't have jurisdiction here. So yeah, I really like that question because I think it shows that there's a big problem and there's also something that can be done.
Anything to add to that, Christine?
No, that's great.
Okay, let's see here. Bear with me one second. Got a bunch here. Yeah, I see one question, and I'm going to slightly alter it to make it a little more open. Um, what uh, what is the constitutional issues surrounding bubble zones in Canada, and what is
Can you move your hand, Russ? It's making an echo.
Okay, sorry. What is the how do bubble zones work with the Constitution in mind? And is there a problem there, or are the laws currently constitutional on them?
Yeah, so we actually did an episode of my show, Canadian Justice, about this really recently, where we had a debate about bubble zone laws. And it's been really interesting because bubble zones are a tool that were established years ago for a very specific context, and that was to prohibit protests around abortion clinics. And they were upheld by lower courts. So it never got, I don't think it even went to the Court of Appeal. And it was in BC, and I believe there was another case in Ontario related to abortion clinic bubble zones. And this tool kind of like expanded exponentially beginning in 2020. And we saw calls for bubble zones around all kinds of things, you know, schools, libraries, community centers, art centers, places of worship. And now they are in place in many, many other areas. And the Calgary bylaw that we are challenging, the safe and inclusive bylaw that prohibits protests of a certain about specific topics, that's a bubble zone law. And our view is that all of these bubble zone laws are likely they're definitely violations of the right to freedom of expression under 2B of the Constitution. The question is, are they justified limits under Section 1? We think most of them are probably not. This Calgary one is, I think, the most constitutionally vulnerable because it prohibits specified protests. Like, so they choose the topics about which you cannot protest. So I actually think all of them are vulnerable. Even the abortion clinic ones, like that hasn't been decided by the Supreme Court. So it's difficult to say that it's even like a fully settled issue. But yeah, we take issue with bubble zone laws.
Okay, and I've got another good question, I think, from another anonymous attendee. Where was it here? Oh yeah. What's the best source of current information for rights in defending yourself from police? So this is a great question, I think, actually, because it's something it's important to be educated on and re-educate yourself all the time. So.
Yeah, I don't
Well,
have a good answer other than you should speak to a criminal lawyer.
yeah, unfortunately, it's complicated and it's changing all the time.
Yeah.
If you do want to sort of, so actually, one of the projects I have on my list of goals for next year is going to be to do a guide to your rights vis-a-vis the police. So it's something that I think we will get to doing at the CCF eventually. That said, one source that I like when I need to check something really quickly and I can't call up a criminal lawyer necessarily is something called Charterpedia. So if you're interested in your rights related to search and seizure, you can look up Section 8 of the Charter on Charterpedia. If you're interested in your rights related to arbitrary detention, which is Section 9, you can look that up. And it's a really good short, it's provided by the government, so, take it with a grain of salt, but it's a pretty short summary of all of the case law. And I wouldn't necessarily use this if, take this to the bank, but there's also something called Criminal Law Notebook. So you can Google that, and if there's a particular offense that you want to know more about, it really breaks down some of that stuff well. But unfortunately, as lawyers, we do have to tell you that you should consult your own criminal lawyer if you're really concerned about this stuff, and wait for our guide that we'll be putting out next year.
Which would not be individual legal advice.
Right.
Legal information.
Yeah, it's legal information.
Okay, and then I've got one from Carol here. I find the use of tribunals is an attempt to violate my rights by allowing someone who's not a judge or lawyer to decide outside the legal jurisdiction to enforce vague rules they decide on with no legal representation. So I think that what Carol's saying is, what was our opinion on these quasi-judicial, so I guess like quasi-judicial organizations and state entities. So that would include, what about the human rights tribunals and uh, I guess professional regulators, I think, as they're referring to as
Yeah.
well. So
Yeah. I obviously have a big problem with the expanding scope of professional regulators. I think self-regulation is a really important privilege that these professions have, and I think we do want to ensure that professions stay self-regulating, because a lot of like the judge of professional competence is the profession itself, right? Like a doctor is going to know better than a administrative body of doctors is going to know better than a judge if a doctor has given incompetent medical advice and what the appropriate discipline would be for that. But that only relates to the technical practice. The issue becomes when these tribunals claim jurisdiction for, all kinds of other things, private off-duty conduct and speech that's not related to the practice of the profession. And then, the human rights tribunals, I have different issues with just based on some of the track record of decisions that we've been seeing out of them. And one of the big issues is that the standard of review for all of these tribunals is a deferential one. So it's an uphill battle to have the decisions of these administrative bodies overturned. Anything to add on that, Josh?
Yeah, I think Carol, the commenter, the question asker here, has really hit on something big. One of the biggest problems in law in Canada is that a lot of decisions get delegated by, Parliament or by the provincial legislatures to these tribunals that are making decisions about all kinds of aspects of our lives. You would not believe how many tribunals there are out there, and these people are essentially employees of the government if you sit on an administrative tribunal, and they're not judges. They don't have that authority that judges have, but they're making really, really big decisions that affect people's lives, like this decision in Emo, Ontario, where the mayor is now being fined for speaking out against raising a pride flag. And the worst part is the judges have decided that when they review these decisions, which is called judicial review, they apply in most cases a reasonableness standard. So this often leads to these decisions being upheld when they wouldn't be upheld if they had just gone to a judge in the first place who, knows the law a little bit better and respects the rule of law more. So Carol's hit on a big problem here, and I don't know what the solution necessarily is, but we do have too many admin tribunals making too many important decisions, in my opinion.
Okay, and then I've got one question here as well to maybe finish off on. Um, Not sure. I think both Josh and Christine could probably answer this. So, what what is probably one of the biggest misconceptions people have about freedom of expression in Canada? I think that's always a question that's worth asking because I'm always getting I get emails every day from people asking about things, and it's not always clear to people. So, what would you guys think is the biggest misconception, especially when you compare it to the U.S. or the UK or somewhere else?
My favorite is one that we get all the time, which Josh and I just did a video about, which is people say we don't have a right to freedom of speech in Canada. Even under the charter, it's called a right to freedom of expression. And yes, we do have a right to freedom of speech. Expression is more inclusive, it's broader. Expression includes speech, and it also includes other things like, painting or dancing or singing or writing or even silently protesting. So, we do have a right to freedom of speech. That is not just America. We just call it expression, and it's more inclusive. Now, the issue that people always then bring up is that the rights can be limited under Section 1, but there is a legal test for when that right can be limited, and the right must be minimally impairing. It must be rationally connected to a valid public purpose, and it needs to be balanced. It needs to be proportionate. In other words, it must do no more good than harm. So the court is supposed to do that balancing test, and that's where the fight often happens because freedom of expression is a very broad right, includes a lot, and the question often comes down to how it's limited. And we think it's limited too often, frankly, but that's sort of, I think, the biggest misconception.
I'll just add one that comes up a lot, and a lot of people don't realize that the Charter of Rights is meant to restrict the government. And a lot of people think that, free expression means I'm free to say whatever I want, even if I'm like, a private person in a private space. And so this comes up a lot in social media. Social media, there's some people make the argument that they're a lot like government, but when your speech is restricted on social media, that's not a constitutional issue unless it's the government creating some law that
Which they
restricts your
often are.
speech on social media, which they're trying to do right now with the Online Harms Act and their new Digital Safety Commission, which would essentially bring us back to the olden days where you couldn't say anything on Twitter without having your account locked. So if it's not the government doing it, your constitutional rights don't come into play. So it's worth keeping that in mind when we talk about freedom of speech.
Okay, well, I think we're out of time for today, but I want to thank you, Christine and Josh, for talking about your new book. Just as a reminder, everybody that's here, if you want to, I'm sure if everybody here that's in this meeting, of course, has already got their copy. But just in case you want to get another copy or share it with somebody, there's links to both the digital and the print version. You can go to the ccf.ca/free speech in Canada, all one word, to get to a page that has the summary of the book as well as links to where you can buy the book, both in print and digital copy. And otherwise, thanks so much for coming to our book launch, and we'll have more news for you as well as some new events and town halls in the new year.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Bye-bye.